This is Lucia. Can you hear me? Okay, we're going to start over. Sorry for the slight delay, folks. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Breaking the Cycle, a Life Course Framework for Preventing Domestic Violence. I'm Lucia Peña, Senior Program Officer at Blue Shield of California Foundation. On behalf of all of my colleagues here at the Foundation and today's speakers, I can say that we've been looking forward to the release of this report and today's webinar for a while now. We are so excited to share it with you, and thank you again for joining us this afternoon. Today's presentation is being recorded, and within the next week or so, we will be sending all attendees a link to the recording, along with a copy of the presentation and the answers to frequently asked questions. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome Tanya Hill-Kleinman from the Center for Collaborative Planning to give us all a quick technical overview of how today's webinar will work.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Lucia. I just wanted to briefly highlight some of the features of the webinar so that you can interact with us as we are moving through the content. On the right side of your screen, you should be able to see a question and answer box. If you have questions as we're making our way through the webinar, please go ahead and write your question in that box and send it to all panelists. We are monitoring those questions and answers, and we will set aside time at the end of the webinar to answer those questions. And then, as Lucia noted, we will have a transcript of the questions and answers that will be available to folks after the webinar, as will the recording and the slide deck. In terms of doing the Q&A feature, you can see here this slide shows you where the Q&A is on your screen. Select all panelists and then type your question. Below that, you'll see a multimedia viewer, and that's where the Spanish captioning is available. You can, under that green arrow at the bottom right there where it says Show Hide Header, you can click that, and that will hide the selections of font and theme, and so that will make that box a little bit bigger so that you can see more of it consecutively. I believe those are all of the items that we wanted to go over. All attendees will be muted during the webinar, and there's no video aspect, so no need to have your camera. The number is here for folks who want to call in if they would like to listen to the audio, the live audio translation as well. Folks can use this number. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it back over to Lucia.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Again, welcome everybody. Yesterday, Blue Shield of California Foundation published a new report titled Breaking the Cycle, a Life Course Framework for Preventing Domestic Violence. The report is currently available on our website. On today's webinar, we're going to share the framework, discuss the research behind it, and the implications of the framework for the Foundation's strategy to end domestic violence. We will also highlight the importance of the framework for the domestic violence movement and other sectors that we want to engage in the solutioning process. To help us do this, we are privileged to have some wonderful experts and leaders joining us today. In just a few minutes, we'll be hearing from Arnold Chandler, President of Forward Change Consulting, and the Foundation's partner in developing this framework. And a little bit later, you will hear reactions from two veteran domestic violence leaders to help us place this framework in context, Nan Stoops and Eve Sheedy. Before I turn things over to Arnold, I'd like to talk a bit about the Foundation's commitment to ending domestic violence and why we embarked on this inquiry. For nearly 2 decades, the Blue Shield of California Foundation has been working to improve the lives of all Californians. Our mission, to build lasting and equitable solutions to make California the healthiest state and to end domestic violence, has guided our work throughout. We're proud of the work we've done with our partners and grantees and throughout California to help survivors, families, and communities impacted by domestic violence. In early 2018, we launched a new strategic direction focused on improving the health and well-being of all Californians by addressing the root causes of poor health and violence. We set a new bold goal to become the healthiest state in the nation with the lowest rates of domestic violence, and our work is now wholly geared toward accomplishing that goal. Our new strategy expands our focus to look at the many factors that influence health and well-being and to develop new approaches, collaborations, and solutions to achieve our goals. The impact of domestic violence on our nation and the state of California runs very deep. A survey we commissioned in 2017 showed 58% of Californians have been touched by domestic violence, either as a survivor, as an abuser themselves, or through a close friend or family member. Over the past 16 years, our work to end domestic violence focused mainly on strengthening the safety net services that meet the needs of all survivors in California. We did this through organizational and leadership development, as well as supporting new innovation within the domestic violence field. The Foundation has made significant investments during that time, totaling more than $100 million to the field. It is the Foundation's deep and long-standing partnership with the domestic violence field that provided the inspiration, trust, and momentum to ask new questions that informed our new shift to prevention. The power behind changing to a prevention frame is that we began asking different questions. Simply put, questions we weren't asking before. Questions like, what are the root causes of domestic violence? Is there evidence for what works? Does the evidence match the complexity of the problem? Are the solutions relevant to California's diverse communities or those who are most marginalized? And most important for us, what is the Foundation's role to address them? We recognize the strong evidence of connection between a person's childhood and adolescent experiences and the likelihood of perpetrating domestic violence. However, the Foundation sought to better understand the life course factors that contribute to it. This life course analysis that follows identified many risk factors for children and families and lays a foundation for prevention approaches at multiple levels and age groups. We are thrilled to share with you today in the hopes that, like it did for us, it sparks new hope that we can prevent domestic violence, to provoke new thinking and questions, and generate disruptive and bold ideas. Our new strategic plan is underway with a deeper commitment to end domestic violence because we believe strongly that lasting and equitable solutions to make California the healthiest state requires an end to domestic violence. While we continue to support critical safety net services through our policy efforts, we recognize that deeper investment in prevention is needed to truly prevent domestic violence before it starts. Going forward, the Foundation is taking a multi-generational approach to breaking the cycle of violence. The Life Course framework will serve as one anchor to catalyze new ideas, partnerships, and collaborations as we pursue new two-generation solutions, promote multi-sector strategies, co-create new interventions with those who are impacted the most, and explore the future of health. Our new direction puts healing and prevention at the center of approaches to address the needs of families and to address the adverse impacts of exposure to violence in children, in adolescence, and early adulthood. We know this won't be easy, and we certainly won't be able to do it alone. So again, I want to thank all of you for joining us today, whether you're a longtime partner of the Foundation or if this is your introduction to our work. We know you're here because you're committed and curious about ending family violence for communities across California. Thank you so much for joining us on our new journey. And speaking of partnership, I'll turn things over to Arnold Chandler, President of Forward Change Consulting. Arnold is going to walk us through Forward Change's research and bring an overview of the Life Course framework. It would be an understatement to say that we have really been thrilled to partner with Arnold and the Forward Change team on this journey to really understand the root causes of domestic violence and the individual risk factors that bring meaning to our future-facing work. So, Arnold, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
That the animations have been disabled, so I'm not going to be able, on some slides, I'm not going to be able to show you the dazzling animations I put together. But in some instances there, the slide will be a bit crowded, and so I'll guide you through it verbally so you can get a sense of where I am and what I'm referring to. But in terms of how we got here, how we got to the life course framework that's described in the report and the efforts that have been underway for at least the past year, I wanted to go through the steps and give you some of the main components that have been involved. One important aspect of this work was conducting an extensive research scan and synthesis of research in the peer-reviewed literature on the causes and consequences and interventions for domestic violence. We also conducted interviews with field leaders across the state of California who were very insightful and helpful in helping us understand more and interpret the literature, but also help guide us in making some strategic decisions about what we took from it to inform the framework that you're going to hear more about in just a moment. And then we also held 4 planning workshops with the foundation to dig in a bit and work through some of the key issues of the analysis. There were some important goals that the foundation brought to this work that informed our effort, and I wanted to apprise you of those here. This slide's a little misaligned, but I'm going to go through them from top to bottom. The first thing, and one of the biggest things, because of the emphasis on a prevention framework, was to get to root causes and try and move upstream in an understanding of what drives domestic violence. And so we looked at things that happen across a person's life that might raise the risk that they will one day be involved with domestic violence. But we also looked at a structural analysis, which we don't go into in a great deal in this presentation, but we consider the fact that the broader social factors in society shape the risk of domestic violence, and that matters for a coherent and comprehensive understanding of how to address it. We wanted to build from the foundation's strengths and its health mission as well, recognizing that a health foundation brings a public health and a health lens to issues. And so that you'll see is reflected in our analysis, particularly when we look at the consequences of domestic violence for those who are direct and indirect victims. We applied a life course lens, which means we looked at what factors across a person's entire life from their very early years all the way up to their 20s that might precipitate their one day being a perpetrator of domestic violence. And that's a core part of what the framework is about. You'll understand more about that when we get there. We looked at issues from an intergenerational standpoint, recognizing that what's called the cycle of violence has been a prominent feature of work and research in the domestic violence field for several decades. And so we wanted to account for the fact that children have a heightened risk of domestic violence in their own adulthood when they're exposed to domestic violence in their households as children. We looked at program and systems intervention, which we're not going to cover in depth. They are addressed in the report, so you'll be able to find more of that there. But we looked at proven and promising interventions that might address, from a preventative standpoint, the risk of domestic violence for those who grow up to be perpetrators in their 20s. In terms of how we're going to tackle all the content we prepared and set that up as a framing for the framework, the presentation is broken into 3 major components. The first one is domestic violence and its consequences. And there we're just going to look at prevalence of domestic violence based upon national and California data. And then we're going to look at what shows up in the literature in terms of the consequences of being a victim of domestic violence, both for direct victims and for the children who are exposed in environments where domestic violence occurs. The second portion of the presentation is going to take a look at the life course approach to domestic violence. We're not going to present the framework here, but what we're going to do is we're going to dig into the building blocks of the framework. We're going to look at the research literature that shows us the broad factors over a person's life that might raise the probability that they'll one day perpetrate domestic violence. And then lastly, we're going to present the framework in the context of invoking the broader field to move towards life course prevention of domestic violence, to go deeper in the well of the experience of people in their life course to try and prevent the likelihood that they will one day assault their partners. Domestic violence and its consequences. So, as we all are aware, especially being involved in this field, domestic violence is a significant problem in our society, and the prevalence levels speak very clearly to that reality. We have right here United States and California data side by side, broken out by women and men. Women are in the light blue, men are in the dark blue. And the definition of domestic violence that measures this aggregates intimate sexual violence, physical violence, and stalking victimization all as one general prevalence indicator. And what we can see here on the left, looking at the United States overall, there are high levels of domestic violence, lifetime domestic violence reported by individuals, and that there are also similar rates with women in this data showing higher levels of domestic violence victimization, but men also showing significantly high levels of domestic violence victimization. We see that same pattern replicated for California on the right, with the exception that we see that black men show a higher level of reported, lifetime victimization, which is an anomaly that we don't understand from the data in that study. It doesn't provide pointers to that, so we can't answer the question to why that is. But across both the nation and California, we see relatively high levels of domestic violence victimization across the life course, and we see both men and women sharing significantly in that experience. What starts to change the picture a bit, though, is when we look at the impact of domestic violence by gender, and that means we're looking at those who've been victimized by domestic violence. What do they report as negative impacts that they've experienced? And what we can see here, looking again at women in light blue and men in dark blue, that women are substantially more likely to report any negative impact and some serious negative impacts of being exposed to domestic violence. Women are significantly more likely to be fearful at 54% compared to men, who only 21% report being fearful subsequent to a domestic violence experience. Concern for safety is nearly half of women are concerned for their safety, while less than 1 in 5 men are. And in terms of PTSD symptoms, we see that approaching 50% of women experience some type of PTSD symptomology, while roughly 1 in 7 men do. So pretty consistently across the board, across all these indicators of negative outcomes, women experience disproportionately worse outcomes as a result of exposure to domestic violence than men do. One group that is crucial to think about when we talk about preventing domestic violence, especially from an intergenerational life course standpoint, are children who are in the presence of domestic violence that happens in their households. What we see here is that 1 in 5 children, by the time they reach their late teens, report that they've experienced exposure to domestic violence at some point in their household in their lifetime. They've witnessed one parent assaulting another. And so we see a relatively high level of prevalence of children being indirect victims of domestic violence, calling for the need for an intergenerational perspective on prevention. In order to identify what the consequences of domestic violence for victims are, and in this case we wanted to look very much at consequences that are health-related, when those consequences actually trigger a young person to later become a perpetrator of domestic violence. We're going to look at that in more detail in later slides. But in terms of understanding how directly a victim is negatively impacted by domestic violence, we conducted a scan of the literature to try and distill down what, from peer-reviewed analyses, show are strong consequences of domestic violence. We look specifically at longitudinal studies for a very important reason. The lion's share of studies that look at consequences associated with domestic violence use what's called cross-sectional data. They measure characteristics of people and their domestic violence experiences and the outcomes, whether they have other outcomes that might be related to domestic violence, all at the same time. The problem with this is that it doesn't tell us that domestic violence came before these other negative outcomes, which is an important requirement to establishing causality, or as treating that factor as a potential candidate for a cause. And so we wanted to limit our analysis to longitudinal studies that show that domestic violence happened before the negative outcome, and so we could trace a plausible causal relationship between the two. And what we see is that a handful of very important negative outcomes of domestic violence show up repeatedly in the literature. And when we're talking about what domestic violence does to victims, you can bet that these are very strong candidates for being causal results of having been a victim of domestic violence. The one that stands out most prominently across the literature is depression. In longitudinal studies, this has been shown repeatedly to be the result of exposure to domestic violence. In one national longitudinal study, they found that adult women who experienced IPV were 42% more likely to experience depression at a 5-year follow-up. IPV in this case refers to intimate partner violence, which is a specific label for what we know colloquially as domestic violence. Post-traumatic disorder is also a consequence pretty consistently found of exposure to domestic violence, as are suicide attempts. For children who are in the womb, when a mother is exposed to domestic violence, they are at an elevated risk of preterm birth, low birth weight, and perinatal mortality. So the consequences of domestic violence are stark, not only for mothers or victims, direct victims, but for the children as well. So getting to a life course perspective on the causes of domestic violence, or digging deeper into people's life experiences as risk factors for domestic violence, we wanted to frame our analysis a bit to put in perspective where life course factors fit in the overall thinking about how domestic violence incidents are produced. When you look at this chart, we have domestic violence incidents in the middle circle. And we're looking at a nesting of concentric circles that show factors that are removed in both time and kind of social distance from domestic violence incidents as potential causes. The factors that are most proximate or closest to domestic violence incidents are situational factors. And the research documents these, but not in enough depth, and we don't research these not as extensively as we should, but there's some evidence to indicate some factors that are precipitating triggers for domestic violence incidents. These things are like arguments and anger, escalation dynamics, the alcohol use, or the presence of other parties that might prevent or precipitate a domestic violence episode. A bit further removed in time, and that further removal could be days, it could be years, as risk factors for domestic violence incidents are the life course and developmental factors you see there in red. These are exposure to interparental violence as a child or adolescence, child physical abuse, adolescent antisocial behavior, chronic violent offending, violent peer networks, and non-exclusive relationships. These are some of the things that we'll explore later in just a moment. And these are kind of core to the life course framework for understanding domestic violence. But these things happen across a broad span of time. They can be within a couple years of a domestic violence incident, or they can be within decades of a domestic violence incident. Structural cultural factors are the broad container in which life course developmental factors and situational factors are embedded or nested. And that's the blue that we're looking at there. And these are the things that are broad factors that we know precipitate or are associated with domestic violence, things like aggregate unemployment, educational levels, gender age inequality, concentrated disadvantage, and harmful cultural norms as some examples. So to put these things in all a coherent framework, getting from the precipitating factors or causes of domestic violence all the way to the consequences of domestic violence for direct victims and for the next generation, we have this framework here that puts all the pieces together. So we see structural factors, income poverty, unemployment, other factors contribute to the pre-domestic violence risk trajectories, meaning that before a person perpetrates domestic violence, they have factors that create trajectories of risk towards being a perpetrator of domestic violence once they're in their late teens or early 20s. And those structural factors that we list there, among others, contribute to these risk trajectories, and so do life course factors, which we're going to look at more in a second. But once a person perpetrates domestic violence, we know that there's often a risk that that domestic violence will reoccur, that they'll perpetrate again in the future. And a strong indicator of whether or not a strong predictor of whether or not a person will perpetrate violence in the future is whether they've perpetrated violence in the past. And we see flowing from either single incidents of domestic violence or multiple incidents, direct and indirect consequences for victims. We see that those who are directly victimized experience health consequences among other psychological consequences. And when we say health consequences, that we mean both physical health and we also mean psychological well-being and health. And then there's also the consequences of domestic violence for the children who are in these in families where this occurs, who are at greater risk of being perpetrators of domestic violence one day in their lives. So now let's look at what are some of the pre-domestic violence perpetration risk trajectory factors. What are some of the things that raise the probability that a person earlier in life will subsequently perpetrate domestic violence when they're in their late teens or early 20s? And to identify these, we scan the literature again, looking for predictor factors, and we also look for longitudinal studies, going again to we want to identify risk factors that happened well before domestic violence perpetration occurred. Many studies, cross-sectional studies, measure both things at the same time, and that doesn't allow us to establish which factor came first, the domestic violence or the risk factor. Longitudinal studies help us do that, so it helps us zero in on things that might be causal factors that lead to domestic violence. We limited our analysis to longitudinal studies that had sample sizes of greater than 400 individuals, and that included several control variables. We did this, we used sample sizes of greater than 400 because we want to be able to detect small effect sizes that might be important. We don't want to leave out things just because the effect size is small doesn't mean the effect size is not important or that the effect size is causal. And when you use sample sizes that are too small, you can miss those effect sizes. We also wanted several control variables to be included in the study because we want to control for other things that we know might be risk factors for domestic violence so we could see how independent risk factors might operate. So we want to see if there are 7 factors we know associated with domestic violence. If we control for 6 of those factors, is that last factor still an important predictor? And that was an important thing for identifying a relatively small number of very important risk factors over the life course for domestic violence. One important thing to know about domestic violence, you can't see it here, unfortunately, because the animation is disabled, but domestic violence peaks between the ages of 19 and 23. It rises precipitously from teenage years and adolescence. It peaks around those ages, and then it falls fairly precipitously over the 20s and into the early 30s. The important thing about when violence peaks is partly because many of those folks who, when their violence is peaking, have young children. And so this is one of the direct nexus points for the intergenerational transmission of domestic violence. And when we look at prevalence levels of exposure to domestic violence among children, we see that 50% of children directly exposed to domestic violence are under the age of 6. That means that when children first experience exposure to domestic violence, a disproportionate amount of those children are under the ages of 6 years old. And so if you're thinking about interrupting the intergenerational cycle of violence, it's very much about thinking about mitigating the consequences of exposure to domestic violence for small children and also preventing domestic violence from occurring in the lives of small children when they are between the ages of 0 and 6. We distilled down from several longitudinal studies. I mentioned there in the previous slide, there were 25 longitudinal studies that we looked at, and we identified a core set of life course predictors for adult domestic violence perpetration. And adult domestic violence perpetration in this case is perpetration between the ages of 19 and 26 years old. And these factors that we list here are factors that when other factors were controlled, when multiple factors were controlled in the analysis, these factors still had a significant independent relationship with the risk of domestic violence in later life. We see that exposure, looking up at ecological factors, and let me explain these factors for you. Ecological factors are the environmental factors around a person, things that are happening in their family, in their neighborhoods, among peer groups, for example, that may create the risk that they later perpetrate violence. Life course factors refer to behavioral factors or outcomes in a person's life that predispose them to one day to be a perpetrator of domestic violence. And human development factors down at the bottom there, looking over on the left, are things that are in a person that are embedded in their development, things that I sometimes call our operating systems that are influenced by things that happen in our lives, our skills, our sensibilities, our values, our identities, and so forth, that become factors that create risks for us to be perpetrators of domestic violence. And when we look here, looking at ages 0 to 5, among the ecological factors at the top, we see that being exposed to domestic violence among your parents at a very early age is a long-term risk factor for being a perpetrator of domestic violence later in life. And this is a small to moderate effect size. When we look at middle childhood for ecological factors, we see that being a victim of child physical abuse or sexual abuse are small but statistically significant risk factors for later perpetration. Looking at adolescent, ages 12 to 18, we see one of the biggest risk factors there is having large violent peer networks, being among friends, a large group of friends who engage in violence with their peers or community violence. And so that shows up to be a moderate size factor, and it shows a significant risk for later perpetration of domestic violence. Smaller factors during adolescence in our environments include witnessing parental violence among our parents. Even smaller factors include parent alcohol use, witnessing severe parental violence, or partner verbal abuse as small but statistically significant risk factors. Among life course factors, we see that being in a non-exclusive relationship in adolescence and chronic violent offending are 2 small to moderate risk factors for perpetrating violence when we're adults, in our early adulthood. And then in terms of human development factors, we see at the bottom there that a positive attitude towards DV is a risk factor, small to moderate, and that conduct disorder, disorder that involves antisocial behavior or problematic interactions with others is a significant risk factor with a moderate size effect on our later perpetration of domestic violence. Now, we're looking at adult domestic violence in this chart. It's also important to look at teenage dating violence and the risk factors that show up there. We looked at, this is from another study, a meta-analysis that tried to distinguish factors that had significant effects on the risk of dating violence during the teenage years. So it's measuring the risk factors during the teenage years when domestic violence perpetration is occurring. It just made sure to measure domestic violence after the risk factor occurred. So we see here that the left, in terms of ecological factors, that really big 80 odds ratio that you see there, that really big effect size, indicates that if a partner has used prior teen violence in a relationship, in the same relationship, it increases the probability that the victim or someone else in that relationship will use dating violence in that relationship. So if your partner has used violence towards you, it raises the probability that you will use violence towards them significantly as an adolescent. We also see that parent-child boundary violations are a significant factor in adolescence. Parent-child boundary violations refer to parental-child relationships that are more like peer relationships, where the mother and the child or the father and the child act like buddies and less so an adult-to-child relationship. In terms of medium-sized factors, we see peer dating violence. Friends who engage in dating violence is a significant risk factor in adolescence. Being victimized by one's peers violently is a risk factor for perpetrating domestic violence of a medium size. Increased involvement with antisocial peers or being involved with antisocial peers early in adolescence are both medium-sized predictors of teen dating violence. In terms of smaller size predictors, peer aggression, antisocial behavior is a predictor, and so are friends being victimized by teen dating violence. In terms of behavioral factors, we see that general antisocial behavior and engagement in peer violence are two important behavioral risk factors for perpetrating teen violence. And then smaller risk factors are 8th grade sexual initiation, drug and alcohol use, and then general aggression down there at the bottom right corner. So if we want to look at pathways, we've looked at risk factors, but we want to think about those risk factors and how when we're exposed to a risk factor earlier in life, say in early childhood or adolescence, what intervening factors might explain the relationship between being exposed to that risk factor and then perpetrating adult violence between the ages of 19 and 26. And this slide gives you a sense of what shows up as some of the pathways that connect these exposures to later violence. In the case of early childhood exposure, one thing that consistently shows up is adolescent externalizing behavior. So when children are exposed to domestic violence as young children, they then exhibit patterns of externalizing behavior, and externalizing behavior refers to acting out behavior, aggression towards peers, violence towards peers, other types of behavior that's harmful to peers around the child. We often see that show up in kids who are exposed to IPV early in life, and that's an intervening, what's called a mediator between that exposure and subsequent perpetration of IPV as adults. In childhood, we see that childhood exposure, PTSD, and substance abuse often show up as intervening mediators between that exposure and subsequent perpetration. For kids who are abused as children, they often show adult antisocial personality disorder, which is an intervening factor that then leads to adult perpetration. We also see alcohol abuse show up for women as an intervening risk factor in this study for adult IPV perpetration. But in studies, in the Swinford study here, we see that child physical abuse can actually have a direct relationship with adult IPV without either alcohol abuse or antisocial behavior showing up in the child. And so child physical abuse is a very potent risk factor for later perpetrating domestic violence in relationships. And in adolescence, we see that adolescent domestic violence exposure is an important risk factor directly for adult IPV perpetration. So when a young person is a victim of teen dating violence, they often will become perpetrators or have a risk of becoming perpetrators as an adult. And then adolescents around peers who have negative influences can develop antisocial behavior or have a higher risk of developing antisocial behavior, which has a direct connection to perpetration of adult partner violence later in adulthood. We also looked at studies that try to tell us how much gender matters in these risk factors. These are additional risk factors that we're looking at here beyond those that we just looked at. This is from a broad study, a meta-analysis, which is a study of several studies. I think in this case, this was a few hundred studies. And when I looked at these studies, they tried to identify, are there any factors here that really differentiate between men and women in terms of their risk of preterm birth? And among the 60-some-odd factors they identified, the vast majority, did not differ between males and females. There are a relatively small number of factors here that differ. They're not highlighted on this chart, but alcohol problems prove the stronger risk factor for men. Combining exposure to domestic violence and child abuse in a household, those combined prove to be a stronger risk factor for men. But overall, generally speaking, across most risk factors, both men and women appear to be equally at risk, having been exposed to these factors of one day perpetrating violence as adults. So with these predictors in mind, these factors that have happened much earlier in a person's life, we move to the next question of how do we utilize this perspective and think about what needs to happen in terms of moving towards a deeper life course prevention approach, recognizing that if we might intervene early in a person's life, how might we address domestic violence? And part of that meant taking a look at the domestic violence system, policies, programs, and practices that we have in play now, and asking the question, how do they play into this prevention framework and a prevention analysis, and what that means for other strategies we might pursue. And so when we think about prevention of domestic violence, what we find is that the domestic violence system that comprises many organizations and policies and things in play are really very much focused on preventing the reoccurrence of domestic violence among populations that are exposed to extreme and very damaging forms of domestic violence. And what we see here is that domestic violence, let's move on to what this means. Let's talk a bit more about what the domestic violence system comprises. We looked at a study, this is a nationally representative sample of families with children in which a domestic violence incident occurred. And so this is referred to as family violence incidents because children were present when domestic violence happened. And this study said, it identified a significant sample of families in which children were present when domestic violence occurred, and it said how many of those have some interaction with the existing domestic violence system as we know it. And that domestic violence system is comprised of three main components that we'll look at more in a second. But you see those components show up here in what we see. We see that when this occurs, in roughly one quarter of family violence incidents led to some kind of contact with police. And police are the primary entry point for most of how the existing domestic violence system works. So what that means is the vast majority of domestic or family violence incidents that occur nationally never get into the system formally as triggered by involvement of police and subsequent processes that flow from that. Only 12% of family violence incidents then led to an arrest subsequently. 8% of those incidents led to the filing of criminal charges against the perpetrator as identified post-arrest. And then only 3% of those incidents subsequently resulted in a conviction or guilty plea of some kind. And then less than 2% actually led to some type of prison or jail time. 15% of incidents led to contact by a domestic violence advocate, as you can see there at the bottom, which is the second highest type of contact with a system post a family violence incident. The takeaway from this slide is that the vast majority of cases of domestic violence that children witness do not make it into most systems that we have in the domestic violence field to respond to them, which then creates the need for systems that go beyond those systems or outside of those systems, especially if we're thinking from a prevention standpoint. The core of the existing domestic violence response system has three major components that are listed here. And one of the questions that we want to look at in thinking about these systems, if we're looking from a prevention standpoint, is how well these systemic responses prevent domestic violence or prevent harm to the victims of domestic violence. The first major system, which has the lion's share of resources and is the biggest part of the domestic violence system, is punishment and deterrence of perpetrators. And I'm sorry, these are reversed. It should be arrest and prosecution under that list. And then crisis response for victims, that often leads to survivor services, which is on the left, and that should be over in the middle right there. And then over treatment and behavior change for perpetrators, which the most common form of intervention there are batterer intervention programs. But these three are the major components and the lion's share of what the existing domestic violence system does. So one of the first things we wanted to look at is the punishment and deterrence system that has the lion's share of resources is the front line of the domestic violence system, which involves arrest and prosecution, as we saw before, is the most common response, or one of the most common responses to a family violence incident. What do we see as the evidence about what arrest and prosecution actually do for preventing domestic violence reoccurrence? And what we found is that early findings that gave rise to something called mandatory arrest laws that was very influential starting in the 1980s was subsequently debunked by later rigorous research that showed that maybe mandatory arrests or a punitive approach, a punitive paradigm, may not be as beneficial either preventing domestic violence or as helpful to the victims of domestic violence. There was an early study looking over on the left in Milwaukee in the 1980s, which evaluated the effect of mandatory arrest of a suspected perpetrator of domestic violence incidents versus a warning and release of domestic violence, suspected domestic violence perpetrators. They wanted to know if mandatory arrest actually led to a reduced re-victimization rate compared to warning a person and then not arresting them. And that study had a 6-month follow-up and found out that there was a statistically significant reduction in re-victimization for those who were mandatorily arrested versus those who were just warned and released. That single study gave rise to a wave of policies across the country to implement mandatory arrest or pro-arrest policies. And so subsequent research conducted over the past years has asked the question, when we adopted these mandatory arrest policies across the country or pro-arrest policies, did they make victims better off and did they reduce re-victimization? And what we found was sobering and concerning. One of the first findings is that arrests don't reduce domestic violence reoccurrence. A national study of domestic violence incidents between 1996 and 2012 found that arrests had zero effect on rates of re-victimization for victims. Another study that looked at mandatory arrests and actual domestic violence homicides found that using a quasi-experimental design found that states that adopted mandatory arrest laws actually saw a 60% increase in domestic violence homicides compared to states that did not. And then further, researchers conducted a 23-year follow-up to that original Milwaukee study that I talked about on the left, the one that was conducted in the 80s. They looked at how were victims doing 23 years later for those whose perpetrator of domestic violence was mandatorily arrested versus those whose suspected perpetrator was warned and released. And what they found was very alarming. They found that victims whose perpetrator was mandatorily arrested were 64% more likely to die of all-cause mortality, not being a victim of domestic violence, but all causes of mortality, including heart disease, strokes, and other common ailments. Those whose partners were mandatorily arrested were 64% more likely to die of all-cause mortality than those whose partners were warned and released. So in this particular case, there was a causal effect of mandatory arrest that was negative, not just for victimization, but for other health outcomes for these women. And what's important is that we noticed that the effect size in the study was concentrated overwhelmingly among Black women, whose risk rose by 100% compared to 9% for white women. And then if Black women had jobs, their risk rose by 420%. So what this entails is that victims when mandatory arrest policies were implemented, victims whose partner was mandatorily arrested were more likely to die 23 years later than victims whose partners were not mandatorily arrested from all-cause mortality, which raises alarm bells for whether punitive approaches are effective or beneficial overall for victims. Survivor advocacy services, which are often triggered after law enforcement involvement, have been studied as well. And a meta-analysis of studies found that intensive advocacy following a domestic violence incident will improve short-term quality of life and reduce physical abuse 1 to 2 years later for women who receive those services. So what we see is survivor advocacy services do work, and they are an important side of it, but the qualification is that those services must be intensive services, not just brief or short-term services. Brief advocacy may provide small short-term mental health benefits and reduce abuse, particularly in pregnant women, for less severe abuse. So brief advocacy can work, but in specific contexts, and effects are short-term, not long-term the way we'd want. Better intervention programs, commonly based on the Duluth model or variants of the Duluth model, have been adopted across the country and they focus on confronting the endorsement of learned violent behavior, involve things like the power and control wheel. And what we see from 22 studies that were meta-analyzed, evaluating batterer intervention programs is that the treatment efficacy for violent batterer males found that BIPs produce little reduction in recidivism beyond the effect of arrest. So the takeaway from this broadly is that either batterer intervention programs don't work or they don't work very much, that they're not really a critical frontline preventative approach for reducing domestic violence revictimization. So some of the key takeaways from this literature on preventing recidivism of domestic violence are that the vast majority of domestic violence incidents do not become involved in the domestic violence system. That means they're outside of the common system we use. And so from a prevention standpoint, we need to find new strategies to reach those populations. Most core components of the domestic violence system are weak on prevention, meaning that they don't actually do a great job of reducing recidivism, except for intensive advocacy services for survivors. But generally speaking, the existing system has significant limitations on preventing recidivism. The law enforcement aspects of the core DV system appear to potentially do more harm than good for victims. The punitive deterrence paradigm that defines the law enforcement approach may be counterproductive, and there's a call for some new approaches that have been in evidence across the country and that are showing up in the literature that we need to take a closer look at. Intensive domestic violence advocacy services appear generally beneficial and should be lifted up and elevated as important services that are needed. And then better intervention programs that get a lot of resources and are a staple of domestic violence recidivism prevention appear not to be as effective as we'd hope in reducing domestic violence. So moving now to the question of deep prevention, taking all we've seen so far, we see that the domestic violence system focused on domestic violence reoccurrence has some severe limitations from a prevention standpoint. And if we want to address domestic violence, given the fact that the lion's share of the population that we want to affect is not affected by that system, we need to go deeper from a prevention standpoint and try and see about the possibility of altering pre-domestic violence risk trajectories. And with that, it brings us to the framing of what we call a life course prevention approach. And this is a way of framing the problem. I don't go in depth here on the interventions. Those are talked more about in the report and how to think about interventions. When we looked at the literature, what we found is that there are a number of interventions, but the intervention space has some promising areas to it, some factors, some interventions that appear proven. But overall, there's a need for a lot of innovation in the field. There's a need for new models, refinement of existing models, the exploration of new approaches and mechanisms within existing models in order to get to some of these deeper prevention approaches. One of the things that Lucia talked about at the top that will be talked about in the report, and it's very important, is the need for dual generation approaches that try, as I mentioned, address the fact that mothers and small children are exposed to domestic violence at around similar times, or domestic violence happens in families at the same time that children are between the ages of 0 and 6. And so we want to tie prevention and mitigation of domestic violence exposure for those children to prevention and mitigation for those mothers or those parents at the same time. But looking at this framework that you see before you, what we try to do is take everything that was presented so far and put it in a coherent analysis to show how you get from pathways in early childhood all the way up to the perpetration of domestic violence in early adulthood. And what we see here is those early family factors that happen in early childhood, exposure to parental violence, child physical abuse, et cetera. Those can accumulate along with life course and developmental factors that happen during that time, like insecure attachment, stress dysregulation, externalizing behaviors, and then subsequent peer aggressive and behavioral problems. When children are exposed to those violence aspects earlier in life, these other factors can result and start the beginning of a pathway, which is that red arrow that goes down over on the right. We can see that those early factors that align up across these categories of ecological risk, life course and developmental risk, and behavioral outcomes that then lead to later perpetration of domestic violence. In middle childhood, we see similar factors at play: witnessing parental violence, child physical and sexual abuse, stress dysregulation, externalizing behavior there in the middle of the life course and developmental factors, and then academic problems, peer aggression, and behavioral problems that show up connected to witnessing parental violence and so forth, become a behavioral risk pattern that then can lead later to the perpetration of domestic violence. And then adolescence, one of the important things about adolescence is that ecological environments change quite a bit when children enter adolescence. Their peers become much more significant in influencing their probability of later becoming perpetrators of domestic violence. So if they've experienced family risk factors like physical abuse, child sexual abuse, or witnessing family parental violence, if that happens and then later they're around peers who engage in violence or engage in teen dating violence, they experience a double whammy or a cumulative effect of ecological factors that happen at home, as well as ecological factors that happen outside of home that increase their risk of becoming perpetrators of domestic violence. And we see some of the behavioral factors show up as alcohol and substance abuse, general delinquency, antisocial behavior, and perpetration of violence. So when you look down at the right, what we can see here is a pathway of behavioral factors that can cascade. But looking across the left, we see the exposures that give risk to those behavioral cascades that ultimately lead to the perpetration of domestic violence. So wrapping up here, I wanted to give you some of the sense of the strategic principles for prevention that should inform the types of interventions we focus on, that embed some of the learnings we have about a life course preventative framework. And that's that family-centered prevention, particularly for families with young children, is very important here from a prevention standpoint. Prevention pathways outside formal domestic system, including voluntary and couple family services, are important, particularly because so many of families that have domestic violence occurring never become involved in the formal DV system. We need to address healing as much as behavioral change priorities, especially since there are early precursor factors in the life course that raise the probability that a person perpetrates domestic violence. So trying to mitigate those factors or address those factors are as important as simply changing their behavior. We need to deprioritize punitive approaches and systems that have garnered the lion's share of resources and a lot of governance of the domestic violence system and give more weight to preventative approaches that are less punitive. We need dual generation from prenatal through adolescence, meaning we need factors that tie preventing domestic violence for parents to preventing domestic violence for children. We also should target high poverty neighborhoods where we know domestic violence is concentrated. We should bridge the health and domestic violence sectors, and we should target communities of color who show a disproportionate risk of domestic violence victimization and perpetration. So with that, I'll hand it back to the facilitator.
Thank you, Arnold. I know there's a lot to digest here, everyone, and we're seeing a lot of great questions coming through the Q&A box. Keep them coming, and just as a reminder, if you have a question, you can submit it through the Q&A box in the right side of the WebEx window. We'll answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentations. And for those that we don't get to today, we'll answer in writing when we send the recording and the other materials. But first, before we get to the Q&A, we are going to hear some reactions to Arnold's presentation from two DV leaders in the domestic violence movement. We'll first hear from Nan Stoops and then Eve Sheedy. They'll share their perspectives on the framework and what it means to them in the context of their work, the field, and the domestic violence movement for more broadly. First, we're going to hear from Nan. Hopefully, Nan, you're on. Nan Stoops is a strategic advisor to the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. She's a national leader in the domestic violence movement. She's a fellow with the Novo Foundation's Movement to End Violence, and we're so excited to have Nan's not only reflection, but I'm looking forward to some of the provocative questions that this raises from her perspective. Thank you for joining us, Nan.
Okay, thanks, Lucia. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I will have no way of knowing if you can't, so I'm just going to keep going. I have like this long list of kind of thank yous and gratitudes for Lucia and Arnold and the Foundation and Forward Change, but I'm going to kind of, in the interest of time, jump to what I think the implications and questions are for the domestic violence field. And, you know, I mean, I think we all have to kind of just say, OMG. You know, I had the opportunity to hear Arnold's presentation last year, and I'm still like, my mind is kind of blown by it. So I know it's a lot to take in, and I just would encourage folks to really read the report and spend time talking with each other, with your colleagues and with your organizations about what this might mean for us. So the first thing that I want to say, I have like kind of 4 or 5 points and then a small handful of questions. One thing is that it's clear to me that we, and when I say we, I mean kind of the field as a whole, that we need to shift from interventions with individual survivors and individual perpetrators to interventions with whole families. So that means working with those who cause harm. It means working with couples as couples. It means watching children for indicators of risk. And it means responding early to episodic violence or abuse that falls outside of our traditional definitions of domestic violence and intimate partner violence. We also need to consider the location and structure of our work. So, I think we need to spend less time in shelter or our offices and more time in people's homes and in their communities. We'll need to rethink our notions of safety, confidentiality, and advocacy. We need to look beyond our usual suspects for innovation and partnership, and we're going to need to let go, both metaphorically and literally, of the bricks and mortar of our work. We know this already, that we must rethink our relationship to criminalization. The challenge here is in avoiding the bottomless pit of debate, compromise, and incremental reform. Let's shift instead to a divest, reinvest approach that redirects our attention to restorative and transformative justice alternatives, and that keeps justice interventions in proper balance with prevention work. Let's study the exciting models that are out there and learn about what our role might be in supporting and centering new solutions. And finally, if we are serious about ending domestic violence, we've got to prioritize and devote substantial resource to the collision of situational, life course, and structural factors that Arnold discussed. This is where the rubber meets the road in our commitment to marginalized communities. We've got to dig deep on multi-generational trauma and the way it is rooted in and reinforced by poverty and white supremacy. To me, the greatest gift of the Life Course framework is that it points us squarely and unequivocally in the direction of economic justice and race equity. To the questions at hand, if you know me, you know that I have a few questions or just a few answers and many, many questions. And I ask them only because I know from working with so many of you that we care and that we have the capacity to change. Will the field be able to make the structural and programmatic changes that are needed in order to pursue a bold violence prevention agenda? Can we talk ourselves into these changes rather than out of them? In the words of our colleague Caroline Laporte, can our values survive our analysis? Can we scale up in ways that are not about replication and calcification into new structures, but are more like scaling out with nimbleness and flexibility beyond public institutions and private nonprofits? Do we have the humility, vulnerability, and adventurous spirit that are required to go all in? Do we have the transformative will to keep our field evolution aligned and at pace with the evolution of our communities? I know there's tremendous imagination in the field right now. We are in such a moment politically and culturally. So I want to thank the Foundation and Arnold again. The Life Course framework comes at the right time. We are some of the right people, and I hope we will continue to work together to do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Nan. I think, as usual, you just put some bold stuff out there, and I'm just so excited, really, to embrace some of the challenges and the opportunities you just outlined, not just for the field, but for our foundation and philanthropy as well. I'm now going to turn to Eve Sheedy, Executive Director of the Los Angeles County Department of Public Health Domestic Violence Council. Eve is a longtime leader in California's domestic violence movement, both at the state level and at the Los Angeles County level. For those of you who know LA County, you know that it's that it's almost a state within itself. So your perspective is going to be profound, Eve, and I'm really excited to have you join us today to share your thoughts and reflections and provocative questions.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Lucia, Blue Shield, Arnold, and Nan, and to all the people on the phone whose work is so critical on a day-to-day basis. And I'm really honored to be part of this webinar and part of this journey. For those of you, and I appreciate Lucia acknowledging not only how big, but how sort of strategically important Los Angeles is. For those of you who don't know me and what's going on in Los Angeles, this work is truly in sync with what we're trying to do here. In November of 2017, the Board of Supervisors in Los Angeles moved our Domestic Violence Council and our work within the County of Los Angeles, which has over 10 million people, into the public health system. So I came to this job about 6 months ago, and I am not an expert in public health, but I am learning. But it really is similar in outlook and in its focus on prevention in the kind of it's in sync with I'm sorry, I'm stuttering here, with the presentation that we just heard. So like the presentation we talked about addressing this on multiple levels and on having multiple sector approaches, that's what we are trying to do in Los Angeles. So again, I think it's really important to underscore that nobody is attempting, and there is absolutely no sort of criticism or anything of that nature about the services that we provide, but there is a recognized need to expand our outlook and to expand how we look at this. And one of the things public health does is tries to expand that lens. And some of the things raised, like looking at the policies and practices that impact DV, are similar to how we look at DV from a community perspective in public health. For example, we look at domestic violence and alcohol, and we may have been reluctant to look at that connection because we don't want to look at it and give someone an excuse for being abusive. On the other hand, we really need to look at that and look at, are there solutions? Is there a correlation between those two activities that we can address? Are there too many liquor stores in a community? Is there green space in a community for people to engage in play, for the kind of activities that are either making our communities stronger or making them less strong? And how is that impacting the perpetration of domestic violence? Additionally, as Arnold was saying, we have to look at some of these social determinants, and that comes out in looking at racism and looking at poverty and looking at, are we looking to incarcerate people? Can we look at the system of incarceration without really looking at what is the impact on certain communities? And we've learned from the data that was just shared that that's not working to end domestic violence. So we have to start to look elsewhere. What are these other solutions, and how can we look sort of with this broader lens to include not only people who are impacted by domestic violence, by being victimized by domestic violence, but how can we provide systems and build systems which also do not continue to create additional people who are perpetrating domestic violence. In Los Angeles, what we have done traditionally is try to connect different previously siloed areas and look at them together. We've looked at the connection of domestic violence and gang violence also, which is indicated by the data presented, becomes a very important connection. We've looked at domestic violence and homelessness, and we've just brought back our domestic violence and health care committee. So we really want to stress that by joining together, by not just sort of siloing out domestic violence and siloing out what it is that's happening and what is our individual response, that it's time to really step back, to look at our communities, to look what we could do both in conjunction with other fields, but in conjunction with these larger kinds of principles and how we can partner with our allies to make our responses to this more effective. Additionally, I just want to, in the public health lens, indicate how important it is to look at the data. And I want to thank Blue Shield and Arnold for doing so in such an effective way. The data is critical, as is the input from the field, but we need to look at the data to find out what's working and what doesn't work. So those are all my thoughts. I want to thank you for listening, and I urge everyone to keep an open mind and to continue to work together. We can explore new responses, and we will continue to get really wonderful results. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Eve, and we're so grateful to both you and Nan for joining us today and sharing your insights. I think that you both raised some really compelling insights in your roles, both in the field and in the sectors in which you engage and want to engage. And I appreciate you raising bold questions for the Foundation and others to consider. As I said earlier, that the understanding the root causes of domestic violence is the first step toward preventing it. I really appreciate some of the framing that the two of you have elevated, because you're really putting out there what that really means and what it causes us not just to do from the research perspective, but really to play with these concepts and put the domestic violence survivors and families at the center of our solutions. The report for the Foundation provides us with new insights into the cycle of violence and the many factors that impact individuals, families, and communities to perpetuate the cycle. It also raises important questions about how best to use these insights to develop effective interventions. The work ahead is to translate this into real, lasting progress. Some of the directions that Nan and Eve just suggested are really exciting to us as we partner with different kinds of leaders and different kinds of organizations and sectors to think about what's possible. What I'd like to do now is briefly share a few of the insights and potential actions that the Foundation is considering to apply this framework. I think quite simply what I want to say is that this framework has transformed our perspective on prevention. Going in, we understood the complexity of domestic violence. However, this analysis shows us how risk factors can take root at a very early age, and there are critical entry points across the life course to break the generational cycle of violence. From a practice perspective, the risk factors underscored by this analysis, particularly the experience of child abuse and child witnessing domestic violence, has led us to rethink how we define even who is a survivor, and it also identified the earlier entry points for prevention, regardless of gender. We are now taking a broader, more inclusive approach, and that will include children. We find the two-generation approach to be very compelling and a new frame that we're looking to most effectively invest in as we consider our prevention and policy approaches that improve outcomes for both parents and their children. Current systems seem to be largely geared toward the child or the parent, but not both, or the adult caregiver. The current high rates of domestic violence and the limited evidence base indicates this is an area that needs much more attention, and the Foundation is looking at what we can do to drive some change in that space. The life course analysis underscores the importance of motivating many sectors and movements to address family violence in their approach. The determinants and root causes of family violence overlap with those of a number of other social problems faced by a range of sectors, such as education, justice, child welfare, behavioral health, and others. Witnessing domestic violence is such a potent predictor of delinquent behavior, community violence, depression, incarceration, homelessness, generational poverty. Yet efforts to address these issues rarely integrate an awareness of family violence and the role it plays to achieving meaningful outcomes. We want to explore and invest in solutions in this multi-sector space as well. The research also makes clear that the existing system of punitive accountability for harm doers can actually cause more harm than good for some survivors. We know that accountability for causing harm is essential, and we're looking at community-level approaches to accountability that match the complexity of the issue to meet the needs of all families. This finding has resonated for those of us who are concerned about the underreporting that takes place, and as Arnold signaled in one of the slides, and in meeting the needs of marginalized communities. And lastly, we've covered a lot of data today, but compared to other issues that impact well-being, such as heart disease, for example, the research on violence is limited. And we are not shying away from the fact that the gaps in this data render certain communities invisible, including but not limited to California's Asian Pacific Islander, Native American, LGBTQ, and immigrant populations. We need to build our understanding of not only how domestic violence affects our communities, but how prevention solutions need to be tailored to meet the needs of those communities as well. We've been seeing a lot of questions come in, so I'm going to turn this over to Christine Vaughn, our Director of Communications and Public Affairs, to facilitate today's Q&A session.
Thank you, Lucia. Great questions coming in. Please keep sending them through the Q&A box. Arnold, the first question is coming for you, and it's a little bit based off of Lucia's last remarks there. And can you talk a little bit about whether LGBTQI, gender nonconforming people were included in the research that you saw, why or why not? And the same question came up for Asian Pacific Islander population, specifically in California, too.
Yes. The answer to that question is yes, both were included in the research. We scanned for that research. The biggest dilemma when it comes to prevalence data for the population overall, say for California or the United States, is that there's not really studies that break out the LGBTQ population as a subgroup. They generally do race and gender only, and that's generally it. And so we're limited in providing that data in this slide and in the report on that for that reason. There are smaller studies with smaller samples, say in a survey of those in a city or those who are involved in domestic violence shelters or those who are incarcerated, for example, women who are incarcerated, but that doesn't give us the general population level prevalences that we're looking for. In terms of risk factors, we couldn't find studies that showed risk factors for the LGBTQ population are different from the risk factors for other population groups. And so there may be a greater accumulation of risk factors. That may be the distinction for LGBTQ individuals that is less so a phenomenon in the broader population. If they have more of these risk factors at play that aggravate and increase the probability of domestic violence perpetration or victimization. Same with the Asian Pacific Islander population, sadly. The California data on prevalence levels did not sample that population sufficiently. So we don't have that overall population prevalence data. And in searching, we have a similar problem with the LGBTQ population in that studies on prevalence are limited to smaller sample sizes in smaller geographies and don't give us the big picture that we're looking for to put these things in context. Same with risk factors. In fact, there's less information that explores the risk factors for the Asian Pacific Islander population specifically. And in survey studies that look at risk factors, they undersample that population, so they don't show us that as a subgroup, whether there are distinctive factors at play. So we did look extensively at that, but sadly the research literature didn't yield as much as we'd hoped.
Great, thank you. And Arnold, we're going to stay with you for the next question to see if you can talk about what these results have to say about the potential to address domestic violence with street outreach or community violence programs, if that was anything that you came across. And I would open this up for our other reactors if they have experience or knowledge about that as well.
From my standpoint, we didn't see anything in the intervention literature that spoke to that. I can see some possibilities there, but I can't say that I came across a program that explicitly explored that or had a street outreach as a particular modality targeting either potential perpetrators or victims. But because of the importance of involvement in community violence as a risk factor, there may be some connection that is worth pursuing there. I'll defer to my colleagues on that question.
This is Eve. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I just want to add, we didn't do specific DV street outreach, but we did partner with gang interventionists through our DV gang work, and we sort of made connections. So they were more able to identify domestic violence and its connection in any given episode or incident, and they were able to conduct outreach to DV agencies, and we were able to create some very effective partnerships. It was limited and it wasn't a study per se, but it really was effective in terms of developing relationships that help both perpetrators and survivors.
Great, thanks, Eve. Lucia, we're going to turn to you for the next question. A question came in: how does the foundation plan to share this data, particularly around the adverse effects of the punitive paradigm, with policymakers?
Great question. So the foundation will be disseminating this life course paper and actually many of the reactions from the field as it rolls out over the next year. So that includes a number of audiences, and policymakers is definitely one of them. I think we see a real opportunity in California with the new administration, who's very interested in early childhood, and also with the first partner who really cares about gender-based violence and has a deep history with and track record with looking at issues of gender equity. So we're excited about the opportunity to really bring this forward. There's actually some really great leadership at the California legislature on domestic violence. So I think the opportunities are rich, and we will be working with partners to make that happen.
Great. All right, Arnold, we're coming back to you. A question wondering what percentage of domestic violence incidents led to DCFS, Department of Children and Family Services, interventions, and is there any information about how those interventions impact future risk?
I don't have that answer to that precisely from the research. We know that there's a very large overlap, and I believe the data is ranging from 30 to 50% overlap in those who enter the child welfare system for child abuse, who also had the co-occurring factor of a mother being a victim of domestic violence in that household. So there's a lot of relatedness and overlap in those two risks for that population. But in terms of teasing out, I can't give you percentages. We know that there's a significant risk for not specifically entering the child welfare system per se, but there are some studies that sampled just those who were in the child welfare system and found that domestic violence in the household was an important risk factor on a long-term basis for perpetration. But in the overall population, and you may know that the majority of child abuse that's reported in population surveys, the majority of those instances do not lead to involvement in the child welfare system. And so there's a large proportion of those who are outside that system where that abuse or co-occurring domestic violence are potent risk factors for a perpetration of domestic violence. And in terms of studies that have tried to tease out any gender dynamics, they found that that dynamic of combining both parental domestic violence and child abuse simultaneously in a household substantially elevates the risk of perpetrating domestic violence for males as compared to women. But the effect operates for both of them. It's just a difference in size.
Great. And there's a lot of great questions and dialogue happening in the Q&A box. And just a reminder that this will be transcribed and set out along with the rest of the materials from today's webinar later this week. Arnold, it's the Arnold Hour. Next question is, are patterns of domestic violence different for cis or same-gender couples? Did you see this in any research?
I did not. We looked at that and we couldn't find it. It's just an understudied area, frankly. And so many of the longitudinal studies that we use to identify risk factors don't make any distinction about LGBTQ identity as a subgroup. And so we're not able to see how that differs in these particular studies. Longitudinal studies are sadly few and far between. If we had many more, they would give us much more insight and also a challenge with longitudinal studies, existing longitudinal studies, is that they don't oversample populations that we know are very high risk, like low-income communities of color or low-income communities of color living in disadvantaged environments, LGBTQ population. We don't, and the Native American population as well, I want to highlight as a population that is in many ways invisible as a subgroup for longitudinal risk factors. And so we looked at that, but unfortunately there's not much yield there in terms of the literature.
Great, thanks, Arnold. Arnold, this question is for you, but I'm also going to have Nan give some insight on here based on her tenure in the field. Is there any evidence, anecdotal or research-based, that better intervention programs can be reframed so they can have a positive impact?
I would say yes, and I will definitely defer to Nan to expand on this, but there are alternative modalities that appear to have promise, restorative practices being one a particular type of modality. Modalities that are more healing in orientation are cropping up and being tested, and they show promise that not just restorative, but addressing the mental health and psychological and trauma history of batterers as a means for prevention. So there is work in that area that is burgeoning, but it's not, it doesn't reflect a big share of the existing corpus of research.
Thanks, Nan. Do you have any insights on that?
Well, not so much, but the thing that I would say is that it's striking to me kind of how much we want to stay within the realm of like kind of examining and improving existing approaches and interventions that really have to do with after the violence has occurred, and just how hard it is for us to really get into the kind of, you know, the addressing the factors that lead to initial perpetration of violence. And so I guess that's my thing, is like whatever I might have to say about better intervention programs, it is still an intervention. And I really, really hope we can shift to what is it that is leading up to the initial occurrence of violence.
Thank you. Eve, we have a question here that we're hoping you can weigh in on. We've had several questions come in about law enforcement, advocates, and prevention programs not collaborating effectively on this issue. How can we encourage this type of collaboration going forward?
Okay, I'm no longer in law enforcement, but I will address that. I mean, I want to echo what Nan just said. I think it's really important to understand what the data said and to look beyond that. If a law enforcement response is not helping a large number of people, I think we have to look to providing support for people for whom that's not helping. Of course, I mean, I think the problem is there are differing agendas, and until such time as law enforcement is willing to accept the fact that filing a case, getting a conviction may not be might not be success in the realm of what a particular survivor or a particular family needs, then we're not going to be able to make progress within that system. Right now, the goals, what it looks like to me is that the goals just sort of go different directions once someone calls the police. So we have very good DART teams here where we pair police with advocates, but the ultimate goal is to file a case, and sometimes that's not the response that's going to be most effective for that family or that survivor. So we really have to look at what are the underlying assumptions and underlying goals of the people who are participating in those systems.
You know, Eve, thank you for that response. I actually think that's a great point on which to end, which is you know, I think from our perspective, we are shifting the center of the outcome that we're seeking. And I think really digging deep on what is it going to take to prevent and end domestic violence. That's our goal. And as we look at the health of our communities, we see it as a central issue to address, and we're excited that to close with your final point because we have just about 30 seconds left. So thank you everybody for your incredible questions and for joining us through the rest of this webinar. We're about to wrap up, but before we do, I just want to share a bit about next steps with everyone. The recording of today's call, along with the slides and answers to frequently asked questions, will be available on our website, blueshieldcafoundation.org, in about a week. If you asked a question and we didn't get to it, we'll do our best to answer it through the FAQ. All registered attendees will get an email notification when we publish these materials. I'd also encourage you to stay in touch with the Foundation. For us, this is the beginning of a new strategy, of a new approach, of a new mindset. And we want to engage with others who care about this issue, to inform, and engage with us so that we can all be working toward a common vision toward healthier communities that includes an end to domestic violence. I want to thank today's speakers, Arnold Chandler, Nan Stoops, and Eve Sheedy, for making this a productive, relevant, and engaging conversation. We're just incredibly grateful to you. And lastly, on behalf of our speakers and all of my colleagues here at the Foundation, I want to thank each of you for joining us today and also for your commitment to end domestic violence. We're so proud to be working alongside of you. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.